and trade and investment agreements that the United States is working on, both on the Pacific side, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, as well as on the Atlantic side, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. So they are abbreviated TPP, the Pacific one, and TTIP, the Atlantic one. I'm just explaining this because I think that we are going to use these abbreviations quite a bit, and I want to make sure that everybody knows what this is about. And actually that's the main goal of our panel, to find out what are these agreements or these proposed agreements. They are not agreed upon so far. What are they about? And what's the international and global context that they are being negotiated in? Also, who's pushing these trade agreements? I mean, beyond just the USTR, the United States Trade Representative, what are the major business interests behind it? And possibly also, what do the protests against the WTO in Seattle 1999 and other movements on the one hand, and the rise of the BRICS on the other hand, have to do with these new supposedly partnership agreements. In short, what is the U.S. trade, investment and security strategy behind TPP and TTIP? That'll be a part of the discussion. We also want, as a second step, or actually a third step, take a look at, what can we do about it? How can we fight TPP and TTIP, if I may already take that step before we have outlined what they are all about. And we may also dip into NAFTA at some point, because it's a sort of a blueprint in many respects. I think you will take that on in terms of what we are facing. NAFTA kicked off the Zapatista uprising. Let's see what TTIP and TPP are going to kick off. As Larry Cohen from the Communication Workers of America has said, the TPP is NAFTA on steroids. So that's what we are going to face.
But now, what are the interests? It's a very short thesis. TTIP is a class project of the Atlantic Allied, of ruling classes in the Atlantic sphere, of the old domination, old center of the world, Wolfgang would say, the old center of the world since 1500, the ruling classes of Western Europe and North America. A transnational free trade arena will produce a new global paradigm for trade policies, creating by far the biggest economic bloc in the world, defining standards and norms in order to profit from the competitive advantages which US and EU have in many economic fields. First. The second, TTIP is an answer to the rise of leading threshold countries, or BRICS countries, especially China, and the parallel decline of old powers in the capitalist world system. Just comrades of us who are working as MPs in Brussels, we met in conferences in Germany, and they reported. We had a meeting in Brussels with Barroso and all these leading people discussing the crisis of the European Union. And our comrade said, Barroso, he didn't talk about the crisis, he always said, China, China, China. And this is what I said before. They must solve the crisis of the European Union, and they must stabilize this tendency to build an empire, which was characteristic for the past 25 years, in order to realize this strategy of building a global actor. So that's the second point. And one might say the TTIP may be regarded as the last chance and effort to Europeans and Americans to preserve their dominant role in world politics in face of the formation of a multipolar world in which China and other regional powers demand more global power and influence. Now, my last point, and I have to shorten this, of course, is in my argument, of course, this concept and strategy is determined by many contradictions. The first contradiction is that though US and the EU share a lot of common interests to realize these two aspects, at the same time there are a lot of competing interests, not identical interests between the two, a kind of dialectic. Also in the European integration program, you have common interests of all participants. At the same time, you have competing interests, national interests, political, ideological interests, etc. So this still, and the crisis of the Ukraine has clearly demonstrated that the US and the EU, especially in Germany now, at the moment, they have different approaches. While the US said, you must sharpen sanctions against Putin, be more severe about this. In the meantime, the German government, which at the beginning was on the side of the so-called revolutionary forces of the Ukraine, now has come to another position, and behind this are clearly the interests of German capital, which has an interest in the huge Russian market, and which Germany is, in its energy policy, dependent upon gas and oil from Russia. And the former Chancellor Schröder is a member of Gazprom Executive Council, and there are a lot of, and there have, of course, has been pressure. In the United States, they say, you must get more independent from Russian energy supply. In Europe, especially in Germany, we offer you from our fracking, from our expansion of producing oil and gas, and you will be served by us. And this is, there you might see how this dialectics of common and competing interests really work. And it is not, it will go on, it's not yet decided. The crisis, the second point, or contradiction, complex of contradictions, is of course the crisis of the EU. To this crisis may belong that there will be no majority in the European Parliament for the TTIP. After the election, Madame Le Pen in France has declared they will, of course, vote against TTIP. The right-wing forces in Europe and fascist forces, it's sometimes very different for the left, are against America. They are nationalist, anti-American, anti-Semitism and so on. And they are against TTIP, against the dependency, and for the left fighting also against, let's say, shortly, American imperialism. It's always difficult to make the difference, in substance the difference, to make it clear. What's the difference? I always can say from my personal situation, I'm a jazz musician, so I have never, you could never be an anti-American. So, but this one, well, but the problem in the European, not only in the European Parliament, but the different interests, it's now in the formation of governance, and the crisis within the member states of the European Union, they constitute a complex of contradictions which may lead to the point that single states will not allow the European Commission to make this agreement. And there will be an institutional political crisis within the EU. And finally, the last contradiction, of course, the advocates of TTIP in Europe have realized that the political movement against it has grown stronger recently, and that the majority of the European Parliament is not clear. This movement against TTIP fights in the tradition, of course, of big battles which have taken place in Seattle, 1999, in the meetings of the anti-globalization movement, the big mass demonstrations against the G7 and G8 summits in Geneva and other places, and the protest movements of the past years in many parts of the world. So, I think. So let us, that's my final sentence, let us intensify on both sides of the Atlantic our struggle against TTIP in order to strengthen these global movements for radical democracy and for a new world order which is both based upon equality, democracy, and social justice. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Dive in a little bit more to the contents of what these deals are about. The TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the TTIP is the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. We use another acronym as well, actually, in the United States for that, TAFTA, Transatlantic Free Trade Agreement. Rhymes with NAFTA. Might sound familiar. So, because we see it as largely a continuation of broadly construed the same model that we saw in NAFTA, which I'll get into. The first thing to know about both of these agreements is that they're not primarily about trade. They're called trade agreements.
Yes.
That's a brand. It's not really based on the content so much of the deals. There are provisions, of course, that have to do with trade. But increasingly, the U.S.'s so-called trade agreements have less and less to do with actual trade. In the TPP, the Pacific deal, there are 29 chapters. It's very secretive, so it's very hard to get access to the text. But from what we've heard and from leaks that we've seen, there are 29 chapters. Only 5 of 29 chapters actually have to do with what is traditionally defined as trade, customs concerns, the tariffs that one places on auto parts or on corn. These are traditional trade issues. Non-traditional so-called trade issues would include, for example, the right of a corporation to have a monopoly patent over some drug that it produces. That is fundamentally antithetical to free trade, actually. That is saying that a corporation can have a monopoly right to be the exclusive producer and trader of a given product, and that generic firms in pharmaceuticals, for example, cannot sell their wares, which of course means the cost of medicines goes up for all of us if someone like Merck or Pfizer can be the exclusive provider of a good. So that's actually a restriction on trade, and yet is put into this free trade agreement. There are also terms I'll get into later in TPP on financial regulations. There are terms that are akin to the Stop Online Piracy Act or ACTA in the EU that was stopped by the legislatures of both the EU and the United States. Though it was stopped in our legislatures, Hollywood, corporations that were really pushing for SOPA, have managed to get some provisions snuck into this trade deal from leaks that we've seen. TAFTA as well is really not about trade. The proponents of TAFTA even acknowledge this one. The average tariff between the EU and the United States is 3.5%. It's very low, and so we already have free trade essentially. There are a couple of tariff peaks, but it's mainly free trade. And so even proponents of TAFTA have said very clearly in their launching of the negotiations, this is really about quote unquote behind the border barriers to trade. You can imagine what might be construed as a behind-the-border barrier to trade. Financial re-regulation that we've seen in the United States as part of Dodd-Frank or new financial regulations we could imagine, might that be a barrier to trade behind the border? Might climate policies in the EU or GMO policies be seen as a barrier to trade? That's certainly what a lot of the corporate comments that have been submitted officially in calling for TAFTA to dismantle those borders, that's exactly what they've said, is these are border barriers to trade and they must be dismantled, these public interest policies. And I can get into some of those. So that's the overall thing I would leave you with, is that this is not about trade. And instead, what is it? It's really a transfer of power. It's a transfer of power to very narrow interests. Trade is ostensibly, the theory of free trade is that it gets rid of narrow parochial interests and gives the greatest good to the greatest number of people. We all get cheaper items from China, etc. Instead, what we've seen in these deals is carve-outs for narrow parochial corporate interests sold to us under the guise of free trade. And a lot of these, what is put into these deals are things that corporations have tried to get through the legislatures of the EU, of the United States, and have failed, such as the SOPA example I just used, and then tried to get in through the back door, deregulatory terms in these so-called trade deals.